Good morning, everybody. We are ready to continue on in our study of Farmer Boy. Although this chapter is one of the longest chapters in the book, it is probably my favorite chapter. And the title of this chapter is County Fair. If you're following along in a physical copy of this book, it's on page 252. If you are following along in the PDF file, it is in Bright Thinker for you to follow along. County Fair. Remember, let's go back to where we were. We just finished the harvest. We did the early harvest and we did the late harvest. And remember that there came an early frost. Sorry, that's a line from a song I just remembered. But you guys are too young to know that, and most of you, your parents, are too young to remember that anyway. But because there was an early frost, the ground froze and they barely had time to get the potatoes dug before it froze. But they got them all dug and they got them all stored away. So they had a good harvest. Now they are completely finished with harvesting. And this is important, and you will find out why as we move into this chapter. Chapter 21, County Fair. Early in the frosty morning, they all set out for the fair. All of them were dressed up in their Sunday clothes except Mother. She wore her second best and took an apron, for she was going to help with the church dinner. Under the back buggy seat was a box of jellies and pickles and preserves that Eliza Jane and Alice had made to show at the fair. Alice was taking her wool work embroidery too, but Almanzo's milk fed pumpkin had gone the day before. It was too big to go in the buggy. Almanzo had polished it carefully. Father had lifted it into the wagon and rolled it onto a soft pile of hay, and they had taken it to the fairgrounds and given it to Mr. Paddock. Mr. Paddock was in charge of such things. This morning the roads were lively with people driving to the fair, and in Malone the crowds were thicker than they had been on Independence Day. All around the fairgrounds were acres of wagons and buggies, and people were clustered like flies. That's a simile. Flags were flying, and the band was playing. Mother and Royal and the girls got out on the buggy at the fairgrounds, but Almanzo rode on with Father to the church sheds and helped unhitch the horses. The sheds were full, and all along the sidewalk, streams of people in their best clothes were walking to the fair, while buggies dashed up and down the streets in clouds of dust. Well, son, Father asked him, what shall we do first? I want to see the horses, Almanzo said. So Father said they would look at the horses first. The sun was high now, and the day was clear and pleasantly warm. Streams of people were pouring into the fairgrounds with a great noise of talking and walking, and the band was playing gaily. Buggies were coming and going, and men stopped to speak to Father, and the boys were everywhere. Frank went by with some of the town boys, and Almanzo saw Miles Lewis and Aaron Webb, but he stayed with Father. They went slowly past the tall back of the grandstand and past the low, long church building. This was not the church, but a church kitchen and the dining room at the fairgrounds. A noise of dishes and rattling pans and a chatter of women's voices came out of it. Mother and the girls were inside it somewhere. Beyond it was a row of stands and booths and tents, all gay with flags and colored pictures and men shouting. Step this way, only 10 cents, one dime, a tenth of a part of a dollar. Oranges, oranges, sweet Florida oranges, cures all the ills of man and beast. Prizes for all, prizes for all. Last call, boys, put down your money. Step back, don't crowd. One stand was a forest of striped black and white canes. If you could throw a ring over a cane, the man would give it to you. There were piles of oranges and trays of gingerbread and tubs of pink lemonade. There was a man in a tailcoat and a tall, shining hat who put a pea under the shell and then paid money to any man who would tell him where the pea was. I know where it is, Father, Almanzo said. Be you sure? Father asked. Yes, said Almanzo, pointing. Under that one. Well, son, we'll wait and see, Father said. Just then a man pushed through the crowd and laid down a $5 bill beside the shells. There were 3 shells. The man pointed to the same shell that Almanzo had pointed at. The man in the tall hat picked up the shell. There was no pea under it. The next instant, the $5 was in the tailcoat pocket, and he was showing the P again and putting it under another shell. Almanzo couldn't understand it. He had seen the P under the shell, and then it wasn't there. He asked Father how the man had done it. I don't know, Almanzo, Father said, but he knows it's his game. Never bet your money on another man's game. They went on to the stock sheds. The ground there was trodden into deep dust by the crowd of men and boys, and it was quiet there. Almanzo and Father looked for a long time at the beautiful bay and brown and chestnut Morgan horses, with their flat, slender legs and their small, neat feet. The Morgans tossed their small heads, and their eyes were soft and bright. Almanzo looked at them all carefully, and not one was a better horse than the colts Father had sold last fall. Then he and Father looked at the thoroughbreds with their longer bodies and their thinner necks and their slim haunches. The thoroughbreds were nervous. Their ears quivered and their eyes showed the whites. They looked faster than the Morgans, but not so steady. Beyond them were three large speckled gray horses. Their haunches were round and hard, and their necks were thick and their legs were heavy. Long, bushy hair hid their big feet. Their heads were massive, their eyes quiet and kind. Almanzo had never seen anything like them. Father said they were Belgians. They came from a country called Belgium in Europe. Belgium was next to France, and the French had brought those horses in ships to Canada. Now Belgium horses were coming from Canada into the United States. Father admired them very much. He said, "Look at that muscle. They'd pull a barn if they were hitched to it." Almanzo asked him, "What's the good of a horse that can pull a barn? We don't want to pull a barn." "A Morgan has muscle enough to pull a wagon, and he's fast enough to pull a buggy too." "You're right, son," Father said. He looked regretfully at the big horses and shook his head. "It would be a waste to feed all that muscle, and we've got no use for it. You're right." Almanzo felt important and grown up talking horses with Father. Beyond the Belgians, a crowd of men and boys were so thick around a stall that not even Father could see what was in it. Almanzo left Father and wiggled and squeezed between the legs until he came to the bars of the stalls. Inside it were two black creatures. He had never seen anything like them. They were something like horses, but they were not horses. Their tails were bare, with only a bunch of hair at the tip. Their short, bristly manes stood up straight and stiff. Their ears were like rabbit ears. Their long ears stood up above their long, gaunt faces, and while Almanzo stared, one of the creatures pointed his ears at him and stretched out his neck. Close to Almanzo's bulging eyes, its nose wrinkled and its lips curled back from long yellow teeth. Almanzo couldn't move. Slowly, the creature opened a long, fanged mouth, and out of its throat came a squawking roar. Ee-aw, ee-aw. Almanzo yelled, and he turned and butted and clawed and fought through the crowd toward Father. The next thing he knew, he reached Father, and everybody was laughing at him. Only Father did not laugh. "It's only a half-breed horse, son," Father said. "The first mule you ever saw. You're not the only one that's scared either," said Father, looking around at the crowd. Almanzo felt better when he saw the coats. There were 2-year-olds and yearlings, and some of the little colts with their mothers. Almanzo looked at them carefully, and finally he said, "Father, I wish—" "What, son?" Father said. "Father, there's not a colt here that can hold a straight candle to Starlight. Couldn't you bring Starlight to the fair next year?" "Well, well," Father said, "we'll see about that when next year comes." Then they looked at the cattle. They were fawn-colored Jerseys and Guernseys, and that come from the islands named Guernsey and Jersey near the coast of France. They looked at the bright-eyed Devons and the gray Durhams that come from England. They looked at the young steers and the yearlings, and some were finer than Star and Bright. They looked at the sturdy, powerful yoke oxen. All the time, Almanzo was thinking that if only Father could bring Starlight to the fair, Starlight would be sure to take a prize. Then they looked at the big Chester white hogs and the smoother, smaller black Berkshire hogs. Almanzo's pig Lucy was a Chester white, but he decided that someday he would have a Berkshire too. They looked at merino sheep like Father's with their wrinkled skins and their short, fine wool, and they looked at the larger Cotswold sheep, whose wool is longer but much coarser. Father was satisfied with his merinos, and he would rather raise less wool of finer quality for Mother to weave. By this time it was noon, and Almanzo had not seen his pumpkin yet. But he was hungry, so they went to dinner. The church dining hall was already crowded. Every place at the long table was taken, and Eliza Jane and Alice were hurrying with the other girls who were bringing loaded plates from the kitchen. All the delicious smells made Almanzo's mouth water. Father went into the kitchen, and so did Almanzo. It was full of women hurriedly slicing boiled hams and roasts of beef and carving roast chickens and dishing up vegetables. Mother opened the oven of a huge cook stove and took out a roasted turkey and ducks. 3 barrels stood by the wall, and long iron pipes went into them from a cauldron of water boiling on the stove. Steam puffed from every crevice of the barrels. Father pried off the cover of one, and clouds of steam came out. Almanzo looked in the barrel, and it was full of steaming potatoes in their clean brown skins. The skins broke when the air struck them and curled back from the mealy insides. All around Almanzo were cakes and pies of every kind, and he was so hungry he could have eaten them all, but he dared not touch even a crumb. At last, he and Father got places at the long table in the dining room. Everyone was merry, talking and laughing, but Almanzo simply ate. He ate ham and chicken and turkey and dressing and cranberry jelly. He ate potatoes and gravy, succotash, baked beans and boiled beans and onions, and white bread and rye and Injun bread and sweet pickles and jams and preserves. And then he drew a long breath and he ate pie. When he began to eat pie, he wished he had eaten nothing else. He ate a piece of pumpkin pie and a piece of custard pie, and he ate almost a piece of vinegar pie. He tried a piece of mince pie, but he could not finish it. He just couldn't do it. There were berry pies and cream pies and vinegar pies and raisin pies, but he could not eat any more. He was glad to sit down with Father in the grandstand. They watched the trotting horses flashing by, warming up for the races. Little puffs of dust rose in the sunshine behind the fast sulkies. Royal was with the big boys down at the edge of the track with the men who were betting on the races. Father said it was all right to bet on races if you wanted to. You get a run for your money, he said, but I would rather get something more substantial for my money. The grandstand filled up till people were packed in all tiers of seats. The light sulkies were lined up in a row, and the horses tossed their heads and pawed at the ground, eager to start. Almanzo was so excited he could hardly sit still. He picked the horse he thought would win, a slim, bright chestnut thoroughbred. Somebody shouted, and all at once the horses were flying down the track. The crowd was one roaring yell. Then suddenly everyone was still in astonishment. An Indian was running down the track behind the sulkies. He was running as fast as the horses. Everybody began to shout, "He can't do it! $2 he'll keep up! The bay, come on! $3 on the Indian! Watch that chestnut! Look at that Indian!" The dust was blowing on the other side of the track. The horses were flying, stretched out above the ground. All the crowd was up on the benches yelling. Almanzo yelled and yelled. Down the track, the horses came pounding. Come on, the bay! They flashed past too quickly to be seen. Here's a picture of what's happening. If you look back here, you can see the Indian running that they're talking about. An interesting race, right? Behind came the Indian running easily. In front of the grandstand, he leaped high in the air, turned a handspring, and stood, saluting all of the people with his right hand. The grandstand shook with the noise of shouting and stamping. Even Father was shouting, "Hurrah, hurrah!" The Indian had run that mile in 2 minutes and 40 seconds, as fast as the winning horse. He was not even panting. He saluted all of the cheering people again, and he walked off the track. The bay horse had won. There were more races, but soon it was 3 o'clock, time to go home. Driving home was exciting that day because there was so much to talk about. Royal had thrown a ring over one of the black and white striped canes, and he had it. Alice had spent a nickel for peppermint candy. She broke the striped stick in two, and each had a piece to suck slowly. It seemed strange to be at home only long enough to do the chores and sleep. Early the next morning, they were driving away again. There were 2 more days of the fair. This morning, Almanzo and father went quickly past the stock sheds to the display of vegetables and grains. Almanzo caught sight of the pumpkins at once. They shone out brightly golden among the duller things. And there was Almanzo's pumpkin, the largest of them all. Don't be too sure of getting the prize, son, father said. It isn't the size that counts as much as the quality. Almanzo tried not to care too much about the prize. He went away from the pumpkins with father, though he couldn't help looking back at his pumpkin now and then. He saw the fine potatoes, the beets, the turnips, the rutabagas, and the onions. He fingered the brown, plump kernels of wheat and the groved, pale oats, the Canada peas and the navy beans and the speckled beans. He looked at ears of white corn and yellow corn and red and white and blue corn. Father pointed out how closely the kernels grew the best ears and how they covered even the tip of the cob. People walked slowly up and down, looking at the pumpkins. They looked at the thickness of the hard rind and the little hollow where the seeds were. They cut tiny slices and they tasted them. Oh man, I skipped a whole page. No wonder that didn't make sense. There were always some people looking at the pumpkins, and Almanzo wished they knew that the biggest pumpkin was his. After dinner, he hurried back to watch the judging. The crowds were larger now, and sometimes he had to leave father and squirm between people to see what the judges were doing. The 3 judges wore badges on their coats. They were solemn and they talked together in low voices so that no one could hear what they said. They weighed the grains in their hands and they looked at them closely. They chewed a few grains of wheat and of oats to see how they tasted. They split open peas and beans and they shelled a few kernels off of each ear of corn to make sure how long the kernels were. With their jackknives, they cut the onions in two and the potatoes. They cut the very thin slices of potatoes and held them up to the light. The best part of a potato is next to the skin. And you can see how thick the best part is if you hold a long, thin slice to the light and you look through it. The thickest crowd pressed around the table where the judges were and watched without saying anything. There wasn't a sound. When at last the tall, thin judge with the chin whiskers took a snip of red ribbon and a snip of blue ribbon out of his pocket. The red ribbon was second prize, and the blue one was the first prize. The judge put them on the vegetables that had won them, and the crowd breathed a long breath. Then all at once everybody talked. Almanzo saw that people who didn't get any prize. Almanzo saw that the people who didn't get any prize and the people who got second prize all congratulated the winner. If his pumpkin didn't get a prize, he would have to do that too. He didn't want to, but he guessed that he must. At last, the judges came to the pumpkins. Almanzo tried to look as if he didn't care much, but he felt hot all over. The judges had to wait till Mr. Paddock brought them a big, sharp butcher knife. The biggest judge took it and thrust it with all of his might into a pumpkin. He bore down hard on the handle and cut a thick slice out. He held it up, and all the judges looked at the thick yellow flesh of the pumpkin. They looked at the thickness of the hard rind and at the little yellow hollow where the seeds were. They cut tiny slices and tasted them. Then the big judge cut open another pumpkin. He had begun with the smallest. The crowd pressed tight against Almanzo, and he had to open his mouth to get his breath. At last, the judge cut open Almanzo's big pumpkin. Almanzo felt dizzy. The inside of his pumpkin had a big hollow for seeds, but it was a big pumpkin. It had a lot of seeds. Its flesh was a little paler than the other pumpkins. Almanzo didn't know whether that made any difference or not. The judge tasted it, and he couldn't tell from their faces how it tasted. Then they talked together for a long time. He could not hear what they said. The tall, thin judge shook his head and tugged his whiskers. He cut a thin slice from the yellowest pumpkin and a thin slice from Almanzo's pumpkin and tasted them. He gave them to the big judge, and he tasted them. The fat judge said something, and they all smiled. Mr. Paddock leaned over the table and said, "Good afternoon, Wilder. You and the boy are taking in the sight, I see. Having a good time, Almanzo?" Almanzo could hardly speak. He managed to say, "Yes, sir." The tall judge had taken the red ribbon and the blue ribbon out of his pocket. The fat judge took hold of his sleeve, and all the judges put their heads together again. The tall judge turned slowly around. Slowly, he took a pin from his lapel and stuck it through the blue ribbon. He was not very near Almanzo's big pumpkin. He was not near enough to reach it. He held out the blue ribbon above another pumpkin. He leaned and stretched out his arm slowly, and he thrust the pin into Almanzo's pumpkin. Father's hand clapped on Almanzo's shoulder. All at once, Almanzo could breathe, and he was tingling all over. Mr. Paddock was shaking his hand. All the judges were smiling, and ever so many people said, "Well, well, Mr. Wilder, so your boys got the first prize." Mr. Webb said, "That's a fine pumpkin, Almanzo. Don't know as if I ever saw a finer." Mr. Paddock said, "I never saw a pumpkin that beat it for size. How'd you raise such a big pumpkin, Almanzo?" Suddenly, everything seemed big and very still. Almanzo felt cold and small and scared. He hadn't thought before that maybe it wasn't fair to get a prize for a milk fed pumpkin. Maybe the prize was for raising pumpkins in the old, ordinary way. Maybe if he told, they'd take the prize away from him. They'd think that he had tried to cheat. He looked at Father, but Father's face didn't tell him what to do. I just, I kept hoeing it, and he said, and then he knew he was telling a lie. Father was hearing him tell a lie. He looked up at Mr. Paddock and he said, "I raised it on milk. It's a milk-fed pumpkin. Is is that all right?" "Yes, that's all right," Mr. Paddock answered. Father laughed. "There's tricks in all trades but ours, Paddock, and maybe a few tricks in farming and wagon making too, eh?" Then Almanzo knew how foolish he had been. Father knew all about the pumpkin, and Father wouldn't cheat. Afterward, he went walking with Father among the crowds. They saw the horses again, and the colt that won the prize was not as good as Starlight. Almanzo did hope that Father would bring Starlight to the fair next year. Then they watched the foot races and the jumping contest and the throwing contest. Malone boys were in them, but the farmer boys won almost every time. Almanzo kept remembering his prize pumpkin and feeling good. Driving home that night, they all felt good. Alice's wool work had won first prize, and Eliza Jane had a red ribbon, and Alice had a blue ribbon for jellies. Father said the Wilder family had done itself proud that day. There was another day of the fair, but it wasn't so much fun. Almanzo was tired of having a good time. 3 days of it was too much. It didn't seem right to be dressed up again and leaving the farm. He felt unsettled as he did at house cleaning time. He was glad when the fair was over and everything could go on as usual. So there you have it, my favorite chapter in the book, the county fair. Why do you think that the county fair takes place after all of the crops have been harvested? I agree. It takes place after all the crops have been harvested because otherwise the farmers would be just too busy to even attend the fair, and they want everybody to attend the fair. So that's one of the reasons. Another reason is that you probably noticed that there were a lot of crops entered into the fair, into the contests. And if they did not harvest them already, then they would not have those products to enter them into the fair. What does Father mean when he says, "Never bet your money on another man's game"? Remember, he was talking to Almanzo about the man with the pea under the 3 cups that charged $5 for you to try and guess where that pea was. That is probably what he means. A game that's controlled by another person is probably going to end in that person's benefit. It's only going to be profitable to the person who's in control of it. What about the horse race? Describe that race. Yes, we had a bunch of horses. They were racing each other. People were cheering and making bets. And then all of a sudden, an Indian joined the race, and he ran as fast as the fastest horse. Some people even bet on him to win. Why doesn't Father believe in betting on a winner? Yes, he would rather get something of a lasting value for his money. What's the first thing that Almanzo wants to see at the fair? The horses. Of course he does. What makes Almanzo feel important and grown up? Well, I'm drawing a blank on this one. Oh, now I remember. Just those, gotta hate those slick spots in your brain. That's right. Makes him feel important and grown up when he's talking horses with his father. That's what makes him feel important and grown up. What are the two black creatures that Almanzo sees in the stall? Yes, they're mules. Can you describe them? That's how Almanzo described them. They had a long face and they had long ears like a rabbit and a bare tail with just a little stub at the end, and their manes were short and bristly and stood up, and it had big yellow teeth. And when it made a sound, it scared Almanzo. Why does Almanzo feel cold and small and scared after winning the pumpkin contest? Because they're asked, the judge is asking him a question, and he's not really sure how to answer that question. He's not sure if maybe he accidentally cheated. What does he soon realize after he explains and tells the truth? Yes, he realizes that father knows everything about growing pumpkins and about the fair and about competing in the contests there at the fair, and father would never allow him to cheat. Why doesn't Almanzo enjoy the third day of the fair as much? Yeah, he's tired. He's ready to go home. He doesn't want to dress up another day. Plus, all the excitement is over because his pumpkin has already won. Okay, let me see if we need to go to a new page or if we can get these notes. We can start them off. Let's go ahead and I'm going to put a line under yesterday's. I mean, not yesterday's, but last Friday's. Well, actually, it was Thursday's. Write your name. We're going to put your heading on your paper. The date, today's date is 4/12/21. And the lesson is chapter 21. Okay, we're going to start right off with vocabulary. The first vocabulary word is thoroughbred. And thorough, we're going to use or, oh, ooh, off, aw, ow. Thorough bread. That's basic code. Thor, Thor, bread. And that's just basic code. Bread. A horse bred chiefly for racing. Say it. A horse bred chiefly for racing. Say it. A horse bred chiefly for racing. Say it as you're writing it down. A horse bred chiefly, and we'll spell chiefly wrong, chiefly for racing. Chiefly is E-I, piece of pie. The backwards phonogram. We spell it E-I, but we write I-E. We say E-I. Okay, next vocabulary word is haunch. We're going to use aw that we do not use at the end of English words. Haunch. The back, upper leg, and thigh of an animal. Say it. The back, upper leg, and thigh of an animal. Say it. The back, upper leg, and thigh of an animal. Say it as you're writing it down. The back, it would be like our hamstring and our gluteus maximus. The, the back, upper leg, and thigh of an animal. Okay, the last vocabulary word is sulky. We're going to use I-E to make that E sound. Otherwise, it's basic code. S-O-K, sulky. An open, two-wheeled vehicle drawn by one horse used in a harness race. Say it. Drawn by one horse, used in a harness race. An open, two-wheeled vehicle drawn by a horse used in a harness race. Say it. An open, two-wheeled vehicle drawn by a horse used in a harness race. Say it as you're writing it down. An open, two-wheeled vehicle drawn by a horse, that means pulled, used in a harness race. Okay, we're going to put our quote on the next page. So what I'm going to do is show you the notes I have because I write down here at the bottom. If you need to pause the video so you can get those 3 definitions, go ahead and do that. I'm going to flip my page over because we're going to put our quote down. Let's go back. That was listed first, but I really wanted to do it. Oops, that's on the other page. But I really wanted to do it last because I knew I wouldn't be able to fit it in that little space. Remember, we always start quote with quotation marks. Then he knew he was telling a lie. Say it. Then he knew he was telling a lie. Say it. Then he knew he was telling a lie. Say it as you're writing it down. Remember, we are writing in cursive writing, and you need to be sitting with your block stacked, feet back flat on the floor, paper tilted, hands on your desk. Make sure you have proper posture so that you have good handwriting. Then he knew he was telling a lie. He was telling a lie. We're going to add a sentence to this. Actually, we're adding several. So just put your period at the end of that sentence. Do not close your quotation marks. If you need to pause the video during the quote so that you can write neatly, pause it, then restart it. Next sentence. Father was hearing him tell a lie. Say it. Father was hearing him tell a lie. Say it. Father was hearing him tell a lie. Say it as you write it down. Father father. I think I spelled father wrong. Nope, I didn't. Father was hearing him tell a lie. And for some reason, this is just a period, not an exclamation point. He looked up at Mr. Paddock and said, comma. He looked up at Mr. Paddock and said, comma. He looked up at Mr. Paddock and said, and we're going to put a comma there too. He because we're not finished. Looked up at Mr. Paddock, and it's spelled Paddock, and said, and the reason I stopped there is because this is an interesting quote that we're writing down. We have a quote within a quote. So when you do that, when you start your quote, you have double quotes here at the beginning because there's a quote within a quote. Wait, that doesn't go there. Sorry. Those double quotes go at the end. What am I thinking? I raised it on milk. Say it. I raised it on milk. Say it. I raised it on milk. Say it as you're writing it down. I raised it on milk. Period. It's a milk-fed pumpkin. Say it. It's a milk-fed pumpkin. Say it. It's a milk-fed pumpkin. Say it as you're writing it down. It's a milk-fed, and milk-fed is a hyphenated word, pumpkin. Then we have another period. Is that all right? Say it. Is that all right? Say it. Is that all right? Say it as you're writing it down because he's stuttering. That's why it's weird like that. Is, and then there's a dash. Is that all right? And that is two words, all right. And we have a question mark. We're going to end the quotations for Almanzo's speaking to Mr. Paddock, and then we're going to end the quote itself. There's double quotes here at the end. Oh, you can't really see those. I put them into the P. So double quotes, single quotes at the beginning. Whoops, sorry. Single quote at the beginning, a quote at the beginning of what he's saying, and then double quotes at the end because that's the end of what he's saying to Mr. Paddock, and that is the end of our quote. All right, that's all I have for you today. I know it was rather long, but it's a long chapter, but it is one of my favorite chapters. You guys have a good day, and we will be back tomorrow on the 13th for chapter 22, Fall of the Year. Have a great day. Bye.